The bedroom was too clean. That was the first thing the cops noticed when they crossed the threshold. Too clean for a young soldier who'd been home for barely 48 hours. Too clean for a room that had once belonged to a teenage girl who'd vanished 3 weeks earlier. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic beneath it, a whisper the nose caught before the brain could argue it away. Outside, rain tapped the window in a patient, metronomic rhythm, as if counting down to something no one was ready to hear. The missing teen's name was Lily Carter, 17. Last seen riding her bike home from her part-time job at a corner cafe, apron still folded in her backpack, a smear of foam on her sleeve from a rushed goodbye. Her parents had plastered the neighborhood with flyers, her smile reproduced so many times it had begun to blur into a symbol rather than a face. Tips had poured in, sightings at bus stops, rumors of an older boyfriend, a supposed argument at school, but none of it stuck. Lily had dissolved into the city like breath on cold glass. The soldier's name was Evan Rhodes, 24. Recently returned from deployment. Commended for discipline. Punctual to a fault. Polite in that careful way that made people trust him without noticing they were doing it. He lived across the street from the Carters. He'd helped organize the first search party, brought bottled water, volunteered to check the creek line because he said he was used to rough terrain. When Lily's mother cried on the curb, Evan had stood nearby, hands folded, eyes lowered, the picture of respectful concern. So when the warrant came through, thin as a blade and just as sharp, the officers didn't expect the room to confirm their worst fears so quickly. They expected resistance, maybe anger, maybe the brittle denial that cracks under pressure. What they found instead was silence and a bed made with hospital corners, a footlocker tucked neatly at the end, and a wardrobe arranged by color. They started with the obvious places because procedure demanded it, not because instinct believed it. Under the bed, nothing. Closet, pressed uniforms, civilian clothes folded into precise rectangles. Desk drawers, notebooks filled with tight handwriting, dates and routines logged with obsessive care. A photograph slipped from one of the pages when an officer lifted it, Lily at the cafe, laughing, unaware she'd been framed by a stranger's lens. The room seemed to tilt, the floor angling subtly as if gravity itself had shifted. The footlocker was locked. Keys lay on the desk, aligned beside a watch that ticked too loudly in the quiet. When the lock gave way, the sound echoed, a small betrayal that couldn't be taken back. Inside were sealed bags, layered carefully, a tarp folded like a flag. The smell intensified, undeniable now, and one of the officers turned away, jaw tight, breath measured. They didn't need to open everything to know. They opened it anyway because knowing isn't the same as seeing, and seeing is what makes the report true. Lily's body had been arranged with the same meticulousness as the rest of the room. Not staged for drama, not hidden in haste placed. The violence had already happened elsewhere. This was containment, preservation, control. A bracelet still circled her wrist, a thin silver chain her mother had described through tears. The room seemed to hum with a terrible order, as if chaos had been scrubbed out and replaced by something colder. Downstairs, Evan sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't drunk from. He listened to the footfalls above him, counted them, catalogued the sounds. When the officers returned, their faces told him what they'd found before their mouths did. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a schedule he'd already memorized. They asked him questions he answered without hesitation. Yes, he knew Lily. Everyone did. Yes, she'd come by once to ask about a lost cat. Yes, he'd taken photos, he was practicing photography, street scenes, candid moments. He didn't understand how they ended up in his room. No, he couldn't explain the footlocker. He watched their pens move, his gaze steady, his voice level. He never raised it. He never begged. Outside, words spread with the speed of shock. Neighbors gathered in clumps, whispering the soldier's name like it was a foreign language they were trying to pronounce correctly. Lily's father arrived first, then her mother, her face folding inward when the stretcher came out wrapped in white. Someone screamed. Someone prayed. Someone filmed. At the station, evidence was logged and logged again. Fibers, timestamps, GPS data from a phone that had been wiped too carefully. There were gaps, long, intentional silences in the digital record that felt louder than noise. Evan's service record painted a picture of reliability, of orders followed without question. The psychologists would later argue over what that meant, whether discipline was a shield or a blade. As night settled, an officer returned to the bedroom to photograph it one last time. He noticed something he'd missed before, a faint outline on the wall where a poster had once hung, the sun-bleached shape of a girl on a bicycle frozen mid-motion. Beneath it, carved lightly into the paint, were 3 words so shallow they almost vanished when the light shifted. The officer leaned closer, heart ticking in time with the watch on the desk, and read them just as footsteps sounded in the hall behind him and the door began to open again. The footsteps halted, then retreated, leaving the officer alone with the words etched into the wall. He photographed them from 3 angles, adjusted the light, and felt a chill crawl up his spine as he straightened. They weren't a confession or a threat. They were something worse, possession disguised as poetry. He left the room and sealed the door, the click of the latch sounding final even though nothing about this case was. Interrogation moved slowly, deliberately, like pressure applied over time. Evans sat under the fluorescent lights without shifting, back straight, eyes forward. When asked about the carving, his lips pressed together, then parted. He said he didn't remember doing it. He said deployments blur time. He said sometimes you come home and your hands move before your mind catches up. The detective wrote it down, knowing the phrasing would be dissected later, parsed for sincerity, for slippage. They showed him the photograph of Lily at the cafe. He looked at it longer than the others, not with grief, not with fear, but with an almost technical focus, as if evaluating exposure. "I didn't mean to frighten her," he said finally, and the room went still. The detective didn't interrupt. Silence has a way of pulling truth to the surface, even if it arrives warped. Evans spoke about routine, about noticing patterns, about how people leave impressions without realizing it, the way Lily tapped her fingers when waiting for change, the way she leaned her bike against the same lamppost every shift. He said he thought he was protecting her, watching out. When the detective asked from what, Evans shrugged. "From randomness," he said, as if the word itself offended him. Across town, Lily's friends gathered in a living room that smelled like burnt coffee and grief. They shared memories and fragments, sentences trailing off when they reached the part that didn't make sense anymore. One girl remembered seeing Lily talking to Evan once, laughing politely, her body angled away even as her face smiled. Another remembered the night Lily didn't come home, the unanswered calls, the sinking realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The forensic timeline began to solidify, threads weaving into a picture no one wanted. Camera footage placed Evan's car near the cafe after closing. A neighbor's doorbell camera caught a figure wheeling a bike toward the creek, the image grainy, but the posture unmistakable. Soil samples matched a patch behind an abandoned warehouse where tire marks formed a perfect arc, careful even there. The violence, when it occurred, was brief, brutal, and followed by an attempt to erase the mess rather than the act. When confronted with the evidence, Evan's composure cracked, not into hysteria, but into irritation. He corrected a time stamp. He argued about the angle of a shadow. He insisted the bike had been moved to keep it from being stolen. The detective watched the shift with a sinking clarity. This wasn't panic. It was control being challenged. Late that night, a young officer stood outside the interrogation room, listening. Evan's voice carried through the glass, calm again now. "You keep saying why," he said. "That's not the right question." The officer felt a pulse in his throat. He knew the right questions were the ones that scared you to ask. The house across the street from the Carters went dark as the hours passed. Curtains drawn, porch light off, the absence of Evan's car like a missing tooth in the row of parked vehicles. Lily's parents sat at their kitchen table, untouched plates cooling between them. Her mother traced the grain of the wood with her finger, following lines that led nowhere. Her father stared at the door, as if Lily might still walk through it, apologizing for being late. The media arrived with their vans and their urgency, microphones blooming like metallic flowers. They spoke of betrayal, of the shock that the helpful soldier could be capable of such a thing. Old photos surfaced. Evan at a barbecue, Evan handing out water bottles, Evan standing just behind Lily's parents in a vigil photo, his face solemn, his eyes lowered. Commentators argued about warning signs, about how monsters hide in plain sight, about how no one ever really knows anyone. In the evidence room, the bracelet lay in a plastic bag, light catching on its curve. A technician turned it over and noticed a smear of something darker in the clasp, a detail so small it might have been missed if not for the way it resisted the light. She marked it for further testing, her pen pausing just a beat longer than necessary. Evan asked for a lawyer near dawn. Before the questioning stopped, he leaned forward and said something quietly, almost kindly. "She trusted me," he said. The detective met his gaze and felt a flare of anger, hot and precise. Trust, he thought, is not permission. The trial preparation would take months. Experts would debate intent and capacity. Psychiatrists would offer terms that sounded clinical enough to blunt the horror. But for now, there was only the work, cataloging, verifying, building a case brick by brick. Outside, the rain returned, washing the streets clean of chalk outlines and candle wax, leaving the city looking deceptively ordinary. Back in the bedroom, stripped now of its neatness, a patch of wall had been cut away and bagged. The faint outline of the poster remained on the remaining paint, a ghost of motion frozen forever. In the empty space, the hum of the house seemed louder, as if the walls themselves were trying to speak, holding on to a story that wasn't finished yet. The cutout section of wall sat on a metal shelf at the lab, tagged and time-stamped, the shallow carving illuminated under angled light. Analysts debated whether the pressure of the blade suggested hesitation or care, whether the strokes were practiced or impulsive. A handwriting expert traced the grooves with a gloved finger and murmured about muscle memory, about repetition learned somewhere else, long before this house, long before Lily. The words themselves were unremarkable in isolation, the kind that might pass as sentimental if found in a notebook, but here they throbbed with context, with proximity, with the weight of a life reduced to an idea. The detective returned to the creek at first light. The water ran low, revealing stones polished smooth by years of patience. He imagined Lily's bike leaning against the lamppost, imagined Evan's eyes cataloging angles, exits, shadows. He imagined the moment routine broke, the moment randomness won. In the mud near the bank, they found impressions that didn't quite match anything already logged, partial, smeared, as if someone had doubled back. He flagged them anyway. Doubt is useful. It keeps you looking. At the station, a new tip came in from a woman who lived 2 blocks over. She'd seen Evan walking late at night weeks before Lily disappeared, circling the block, stopping under streetlights, checking his phone. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it. Now her voice shook as she described the way he'd paused across from the Carter house, had tilted, as if listening for something only he could hear. The detective thanked her and added it to the growing stack. Patterns were forming, and patterns demand explanation. Evan's lawyer arrived with a briefcase and a careful smile. He spoke of rights and procedure, of how grief can color memory, how the public's hunger for narrative can distort facts. Evan listened, nodding at intervals, gaze fixed on a spot just above the detective's shoulder. When the lawyer asked for a break, Evan didn't move. "I'm fine," he said. "I like clarity." They brought in a psychologist who asked Evan about control, about uncertainty, about how it feels when plans are disrupted. Evan answered in measured tones, describing deployment, describing how chaos becomes manageable when you impose order. "People think order is cold," he said. "It's not. It's comforting." The psychologist wrote quickly, eyes flicking up at the choice of words. Meanwhile, Lily's school reopened, lockers slamming and laughter sounding too loud in the halls. Counselors hovered, offering tissues and platitudes. Her desk sat empty, a small memorial of flowers and notes taped to the surface until a janitor, following instructions, removed them after hours, careful not to read. In the cafeteria, her friends picked at fries, speaking in half phrases, the world reduced to before and after. A forensic accountant began tracing Evan's purchases. Rope bought with cash, cleaning supplies bought in bulk, a tarp ordered online and delivered while he was overseas. The timing raised eyebrows. The explanation would be that soldiers plan ahead, that bulk buying is efficient. Efficiency, the detective thought, is not innocence. It's just neatness. The bracelet's clasp yielded its secret under testing, a smear of grease mixed with soil from the warehouse lot, a match so precise it made the room feel smaller. They added it to the board, red string stretching from bracelet to creak to warehouse, the web tightening. Still, something tugged at the detective's mind. The partial impressions by the creak. The sense that someone else's shadow had brushed the story, fleeting but real. When they asked Evan about the warehouse, he corrected them again, irritation flashing like a blade. It wasn't abandoned, he said. There were lights. The detective leaned back. How would you know? Evan hesitated, just a fraction too long, and then smiled. I drive by, he said. Observation. A neighbor's teen came forward with a phone video shot weeks earlier, a prank clip meant for friends. In the background, Evan stood near the cafe, phone raised, tracking Lily as she closed up. The timestamp aligned with the earlier footage. Evan's lawyer argued context, coincidence, the ubiquity of cameras. The prosecutor watched the clip on loop, noting the steadiness of the frame, the patience in the hands holding the phone. Night fell again, and with it came a new report. Another girl, older, had felt watched months earlier, had noticed a car idling too long near her bus stop. She'd written down the plate number in a notes app, just in case. It matched Evan's. The detective felt the case expand, the edges fraying outward. Patterns again, repeating with slight variations. In a quiet moment, the detective stood before the evidence board alone. Faces stared back at him, Lily's smile, Evan's composed portrait. He thought about the word Evan had used. Randomness. About how some people spend their lives trying to eliminate it, mistaking control for care. He thought about the cutout wall section on a shelf somewhere, about words carved lightly enough to hide, deeply enough to last. In the holding cell, Evan lay on the bench, eyes open, counting breaths. He replayed conversations, adjusted timelines, rehearsed explanations. Order, he told himself, would prevail. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed, a key turned, a sound small and irrevocable. The city outside kept moving, oblivious, while inside the case gathered weight, momentum building toward something that had not yet arrived. The trial began under a gray sky that seemed determined to press its weight onto the courthouse steps. Inside, the air hummed with anticipation, the kind that crackles before a storm. Lily's parents sat shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles blanched, while cameras clicked and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Evan entered last, posture straight, suit immaculate, eyes forward. He looked like a man stepping into a schedule he'd prepared for, confident that order would carry him through. The prosecution laid out the story not as spectacle, but as sequence. Time stamps aligned. Footage played. Purchases appeared on screens, receipts blooming like paper flowers. The bracelet glinted under courtroom lights, a small, devastating arc of silver. Experts spoke of patterns and control, of behaviors that repeat until they calcify into habit. The carved words from the wall, now enlarged and projected, floated over the room like a whisper that refused to fade. The defense countered with doubt, with the language of coincidence and coincidence's respectable cousin, possibility. They argued grief distorts, that a soldier's discipline can be misread, that proximity is not guilt. But the witnesses came, one by one, carrying fragments that fit too well. The neighbor with the doorbell footage. The cafe coworker who remembered Lily's polite laugh turning thin when she noticed someone watching. The older girl with the plate number typed into her phone because fear, when it arrives early, teaches you to write things down. Each piece landed with a soft thud, the sound of inevitability. When Evan took the stand, the room leaned in. He spoke of order again, of how randomness frightened him, of how watching felt like caring until caring demanded more. He insisted he never meant for things to go so far, that moment's cascade, that you can lose your footing without realizing you've stepped off a cliff. The prosecutor asked about the words carved into the wall. Evan paused, eyes flicking to the gallery, then back. They were a reminder, he said, to keep things still. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to bruise. Lily's mother testified last. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She spoke of a girl who rode her bike too fast downhill, who burned toast and laughed about it, who trusted easily because the world had taught her to. She held up the bracelet and said her daughter wore it every day because it reminded her that things could be delicate and strong at the same time. There were tears in the room then, uncontained, and no objection could stop them. The verdict came after hours that stretched like days.
Guilty.
The word landed, simple and immense. Evan's face didn't change. If anything, relief flickered there. An ending imposed from the outside, order restored at last. Sentencing followed, numbers pronounced that tried, inadequately, to translate a life into years. As the gavel fell, Lily's father exhaled for the first time in months, a sound somewhere between a sob and a prayer. Outside, the sky finally broke, rain washing the steps clean. Reporters spoke of closure, of justice served. But inside the Carter house, the quiet remained. Lily's room stayed as it was for a while, the bike helmet on the hook, the posters slightly crooked, until one afternoon her mother took them down, careful not to rush, careful not to linger. She found a note tucked into a book, a list of ordinary plans written in Lily's hand. She folded it and put it in her pocket, carrying it like a talisman. The city moved on as cities do. The warehouse lot was repurposed. The cafe changed owners. New faces filled the sidewalks, unaware of the paths once traced there. But some changes were permanent. Streetlights were fixed. Cameras installed. Parents walked their kids home a little longer than before. Trust became something weighed rather than assumed. Years later, a detective, older now, hair threaded with gray, stood by the creek again. The water ran higher, stones hidden beneath the surface. He thought about the word randomness, about how it had been offered as an enemy when it was, in truth, just life insisting on motion. Control, he knew, is a tempting illusion. It promises safety if you can just keep everything still. But stillness, when forced, becomes something else entirely. At a memorial run held each spring, Lily's name was read aloud. Runners paused at the starting line, heads bowed, hearts pounding with a purpose that felt larger than miles. The bracelet had been donated to a scholarship fund, its image printed on flyers, a symbol reclaimed. Lily's friends grew older, carried her with them into jobs and marriages and children who would one day ask about the girl in the photos. They would answer honestly, telling stories that made her laugh again in the telling. In a cell built of routine and regulation, Evan counted days. Order surrounded him, rigid and unforgiving. Sometimes at night, he dreamed of a bicycle cutting cleanly through air, of motion he could never stop. He woke with the understanding that control had cost him everything, that stillness was not peace but absence. The carved words from the wall were archived, sealed away. They lost their power there, stripped of proximity and secrecy. What remained was the echo, a reminder that vigilance matters, that kindness must never be confused with entitlement, that the quietest rooms can hold the loudest truths. And so the story settled, not into neatness, but into meaning. A life ended, a community altered, a lesson etched deeper than any carving. Lily's name endured, not as a warning alone, but as a call to look closer, to listen longer, to choose care that honors freedom. In the end, it was motion that mattered, the courage to move forward without forgetting, to let the world remain open, and to protect it not by stilling it, but by watching over one another with humility and light.